This week, people around the world pause to remember the victims of the Holocaust and more recent genocides which have taken place in the decades since. Holocaust Memorial Day always falls on the 27th of January, and this year we're marking the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest Nazi concentration camp complex. I'm Siobhán Fletcher, and in tonight's Island Life we'll also be taking the time to pause and remember them. The theme for this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is For a Better Future, with organisers saying it's an opportunity for people to come together, learn both from and about the past, and take actions to make a better future for all. In Poland this week, world leaders gathered with survivors at Auschwitz for a ceremony to mark the huge anniversary. They laid wreaths at the site where 1.1 million people, mostly Jews, were murdered by the Nazis. Amongst those marking the occasion was King Charles.
To be in Poland on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, as we commemorate 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz, is both a somber and indeed a sacred moment. It is a moment when we recall the 6 million Jews, old and young, who were systematically murdered, together with Sinti, Roma, disabled people, members of the LGBT community, political prisoners, and so many others upon whom the Nazis inflicted their violence and hatred. It is a moment when we recall the depths to which humanity can sink when evil is allowed to flourish, ignored for too long by the world. And it is a moment when we recall the powerful testimonies of survivors such as Lily Ebert, who so sadly passed away in October, and who collectively taught us to cherish our freedom, to challenge prejudice, and never to be a bystander in the face of violence and hate. Yeah. And in a world that remains full of turmoil and strife, and has witnessed the dangerous re-emergence of anti-Semitism, there can be no more important message, especially as the United Kingdom holds the presidency of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. As the number of Holocaust survivors regrettably diminishes with the passage of time, the responsibility of remembrance rests far heavier on our shoulders and on those of generations yet unborn. The act of remembering the evils of the past remains a vital task, and in so doing we inform our present and shape our future. Here in Krakow, from the ashes of the Holocaust, the Jewish community has been reborn, and there is no greater symbol of this rebirth than the Jewish Community Centre, in which we are gathered here today. Standing on the steps of this wonderfully vibrant centre some 17 years ago, having encouraged its construction and taken immense pride in opening it, I was filled with a sense of hope and optimism at the life and energy that coursed throughout this building. Ladies and gentlemen, in a post-Holocaust world, projects such as this centre are how we recover our faith in humanity. They also show us there is much work still to be done if we are not just to remember the past, but to use it to inspire us to build a kinder and more compassionate world for future generations, a world of which we can be truly proud. And this remains the sacred task of us all.
Other speakers at this week's huge memorial service included Manfred Goldberg, who stayed in 5 different camps as a young boy. A warning, his account can be quite difficult to listen to in parts.
I was born in 1930 in a town in Germany to parents, both of whom were born in Poland, made their way into Germany, met there and married and lived in Germany. Born in 1930 I had a younger brother, 4 years younger than I. I was only 3 years old when the Nazis gained power. I was too young to understand the consequences, but in retrospect, I know that they began passing a stream of anti-Jewish laws, curtailing life for Jews, confiscating things, pressurizing Jews, limiting their civil rights, eventually withdrawing them completely. Life went on getting worse and worse for Jews. And eventually, when I was 11 years old, my little brother was 7, we were arrested and sent to our first camp. I was 11, my little brother was 7. All adults had to slave labor 7 days a week. I was in charge of looking after my little brother because the adults had to go out to work. We stayed in that first camp for a year. In the second camp, they had a different policy that youngsters or people who are too old to work or too weak to work lost their right to live. As a result, my little brother, who was now 9 years old, was taken away to be murdered. The Nazis had no use for non-productive Jews. I, at age 13, was selected as, from their point of view, a potentially profitable slave laborer, and I had to go out to work every day. But my little brother, he survived for a couple of weeks in the camp, but then coming home from work one evening, he and other young children had gone. They had been picked up by some SS officers during the day, and we have absolutely not a word about their fate, but knowing what we do know, that the Nazis had no use for non-productive Jews, it's a certainty that those children lost their lives the day they were taken. I was sent on to 3 other camps where we had to slave labor, and again, once people became too weak to work, they would be taken to execution sites where they would be shot and their bodies thrown into a mass grave to be replaced by other Jews who still had a little more strength for them to exploit. We were on a starvation diet from the day we arrived until the day of our liberation. In my case, 3.5 years later. Just a week or so, 2 weeks before the end of the war, we were in a brutal concentration camp called Stutthof, which had a high-voltage electric fence surrounding it, as well as watchtowers manned by armed guards. It had reached a stage where some inmates were just skin and bone, and they felt they couldn't take any more suffering, and they began ever so slowly, some of them shuffling on their knees because they no longer had strength to walk towards the electric fence to electrocute themselves to end their suffering. People died every night lying in our bunk beds, which we had to share to a narrow bunk bed. One morning, we had long lost our names. Each one was known by a number. My number was 56478. Unlike Auschwitz, it was not tattooed. We had to remember it because we had to shout it out every morning, and if you got confused and shouted out the wrong number or they couldn't remember it, there was usually a punishment, a couple of lashes from a whip. So it's deeply engraved in my mind for the rest of my life. Numbers were called out. My number was called. I had to step forward. We were sent out, 2,000 of us, on a death march. My late mother was in the same camp, but she was separate from me in a women's camp, separated from the men's by barbed wire fences. As we left the camp under armed guard, we saw a similar column emerging from the women's camp. Eventually, the 2 columns merged into one long column. And of course, uppermost in my mind was the thought, is my mother marching or is she left behind? And likewise, she didn't know where I would be. We sort of began wending our way through the long column, and eventually we found each other. We were overjoyed, although we had no idea what lay ahead. At least we would share the same fate. We spent 7 days on what was called the death march, except in our case, because it was so close to the end of the war, that The roads, several kilometers down the road, were already blocked by Allied forces. So they tried to take us deeper into Germany by packing us into large barges and towing us to sea. We had no idea where we were. I can tell you now in retrospect that it was the Baltic Sea. And after some days at sea, our guards disappeared, left us unguarded. And remarkably, some inmates of our barge realized that we were not far from shore. They managed to, by loosening floorboards from the barge, they arranged themselves as a rowing team around this barge containing almost 1,000 souls, packed like sardines. They managed to row the boat ashore. We ran aground and we jumped off. It was the middle of the night. It took about 15 hours to cover 500 meters. And as we jumped off, some people were so debilitated, their minds no longer functioned, and they just sat there not attempting to jump off. Remarkably, quite unexpectedly, the SS returned at that moment. Half of them mounted the barge and shot everyone still on the barge. The other half came ashore and rounded us up, and we thought our last moment had come. But no, they formed us into a large, long column and made us march again. Daylight began, and anyone throughout our death march who didn't have the strength to keep up to speed and began trailing the marching column was shot by the guards mercilessly. We had been marching for some time when quite suddenly our guards stopped shooting, killing people whose bodies were just left where they fell. Suddenly they turned and ran away from us. And there was jubilation among us. We're free, no guards. And they had realized that the tank column, which was rolling towards us, was a British tank column. And that was our moment of liberation. They were followed by truckloads of British soldiers who stopped, began caring for us. For 6 days, we'd had not a drop of water nor a bite to eat. They had truckloads of food, which they began handing out to us. They allowed us to rest. And that was our wonderful moment of freedom, which to this moment I'm grateful for.
Survivor Marian Tursky was transported to Auschwitz in 1944.
Our thoughts should now go towards those millions of victims who will never tell us what they experienced, what they felt.
And Tova Friedman was 5 years old when she was sent there.
As I was being beaten mercilessly by a guard for not being able to stand still for hours, I recall thinking, I will never let them know how much they are hurting me.
Here on the Isle of Man, we held our own special service over the weekend, with people gathering at St Mary of the Isle Cathedral on Hill Street in Douglas. The annual event sees people gather to remember via prayer and song. Our own Judith Lay was in attendance, and she sent me this report.
A poignant moment came at the start, when Carol Jempson, a leading member of the island's Jewish community, paid tribute to Leonard Singer, who died at the end of 2023, for his diligence in organising the commemoration each year, and his loss was keenly felt when the moment for the prayer for the dead, which traditionally Leonard recited each year, was brought instead through a sung setting by Amy Skye. Involvement of young people is crucial. Representatives from all the island's secondary schools read first-person stories from victims and survivors. Captain of the parish of Russian, Paul Costain, added 2 solos, and Ninth Manx bard Boxy Kloss composed a poem specially for the commemoration. Bishop of Soda and Man, the Right Reverend Tricia Hillis, emphasised the need to remember rightly, for it is by so doing that we make past suffering not an instrument of further violence, but a source of transformation. And the commemoration ended with a blessing, said in Manx by the President of Tynwald, in English by Monsignor Devine, and in Hebrew by Carol Jempson.
The late Leonard Singer was involved in the service for over 20 years, and he always reiterated the same message, that the point of remembering such awful things is to ensure they never happen again.
We must not forget. We keep saying, and we've always said, never again. But unless we remember what happened, then, for example, for children, hearing about the Holocaust, unless you bring it alive to them, it's just a story in a book.
Mr. Singer also, for many years, recited a special prayer at the service.
Kaddish is the Aramaic word which means holy. The Kaddish is a prayer for the souls of the dead and a praise of God. It is a prayer for peace, a condition which has eluded mankind so far. The Kaddish is a message of continuity of the generations, a bridge in the endless chain of memory linking one generation to another. We are asking God to protect the souls of Holocaust victims, millions of whom are buried in unmarked graves or in piles of anonymous ashes. God knows each victim by name and where is their final resting place, and we ask him to comfort all those who mourn. Within the Kaddish are the words, "May he who makes peace in the universe bestow peace upon us."
We've searched in the Manx Radio archives and found this audio of Leonard reciting that important prayer.
Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei rabah, be'alma divrei churutei, v'yamlich malchutei b'chayachan u'v'yamachan u'chayei dekal bet Yisrael b'galav uvizman karev v'imru amen. Yehei shmei rabah mavarach le'alam u'lalmei ulmaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yispa'av v'yisnaman v'yisnasei. V'yatada v'yatalal v'yatalal shemei dekadishu brichu. Le'ala min kol barachata v'shirata tushbachata. V'nechamata di amiram v'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlema rabba min shemaya. V'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Aseh shalom b'mramav. Hu yaseh shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Whole families and communities were wiped out in the Holocaust, and in many cases we don't know the names of those murdered. Dr. Christine Schmidt is the Deputy Director and Head of Research at London's Wiener Holocaust Library. She visited the island late last year for a special event held at the Manx Museum. Her work revolves around helping people find those who went missing in the Holocaust, never to be seen again by their family and friends. She told me the act of searching for a missing person in itself can be seen as an act of commemoration.
And so we just had a fascinating talk really about your work and what the library does, but I suppose for anyone who wasn't here, can you sum it up really quick for me, if that's even possible, of what you do and why it's important to people?
We are one of the oldest collections about the Holocaust in the world. We were started by Alfred Wiener, and we are celebrating our 90th year of operation this year. And we have been collecting about the Nazis and the Holocaust in World War II for those 90 years, and working to educate and commemorate the Holocaust and also collect about other genocides. And what we're here today to talk about is our specific focus on supporting family research into the Holocaust. So this is a history that's still living for many people, and we have brought with us our Fate Unknown exhibition, which looks at the history of tracing after the Holocaust, how people found missing people, and how they were reunited after the Holocaust. So we have a small traveling exhibition, and then accompanying that we have a curator's talk, which is focused on how we put the exhibition together and what it means for people, but also how you can conduct your own search. So this is as I said, a functional exhibition, also an educational exhibition, and also commemorative, because we look at people whose fates were never found, and who the act of searching is an act of commemoration. So it's really wonderful to be able to see people in person and to bring this important collection and this service that we provide outside of London.
I think it's interesting. I think maybe if your family wasn't directly impacted by the Holocaust in any way, maybe people think that those searches are over, or that people have kind of maybe accepted what happened, and that's really not the reality. Do you still see a lot of people coming to you year on year? What's the reality of the day-to-day there?
Yeah, we do. We every time we do an outreach event, for example, we have a rise in inquiries. But yes, it's still very much a living history. And part of this is because of the way that, the cataclysm of World War II has seen archives dispersed around the world. And we talked a little bit about that in the event today, that even though this collection on which we base our family research support, which is the International Tracing Service Archive, now known as the Erolson Archives, has 30 million pages of documentation, and it's the largest collection of Holocaust and World War II related material anywhere, it's still not the full story. So what we need to do is, archival institutions and holding institutions need to be speaking to each other and need to be thinking about how to link up those materials. And then as more and more materials are donated to collections like the library, more and more information is becoming known. So we always say to people, even if you think you've done a search, you've found everything you need to know, it might be useful to open that search again. And we do see people, coming to institutions like every 4 or 5 years, saying, I did this search 4 or 5 years ago, can I do it again? Is there any new information that you have? And there's also the fact that even if we get documents in, the more accessible they are through indexing, through cataloging, through digitization, more discoveries are always made. So it is very much a living history for many people.
And when you sort of take the exhibition round and you do this talk, you're here on the Isle of Man today and we have a history with internment.
Yeah.
Do you sort of find more connections with different things that happen? Because you're right, especially if we're talking World War II, that history is all over Europe and well, even around the world, really. So do you sort of find a little bit more out about, internment, and do you have people coming to you, maybe, are you expecting it today, of people saying, actually, I had family members interned here, what's that like as well?
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons that we came, because we knew that this history isn't actually very well represented in ITS as such, but it's connected to that history because the history of forced migration and the treatment of refugees once they arrived here is important because it links to what happened to their relatives. And so in a lot of cases, it may not necessarily shed light on their experience of internment because that collection isn't reflected in the ITS. But it does reflect on the separation of families, what happened to relatives and friends back on the continent. So I suspect that we will get lots of inquiries coming from here, even if we can't necessarily shed light on that internment experience, because the partners here at Manx Heritage have amazing collections about that topic. We can help round out the picture with our search support in ITS.
So I could talk to you for hours about this. You talked there as well in the presentation about the missing, and it is this fate unknown. You had an example there of a woman who was deported to Auschwitz near the end of the war. We can kind of guess what happened there, but we don't know. If we're talking internment on the Isle of Man, we actually had a lot of really famous internees where we know exactly who they were and what they did after the war. So I guess what's the importance there of cataloguing maybe the names we don't even know, but we know that something happened there?
And that's, I think, one of the things I mentioned, that this exhibition is also marking it as searching as an act of commemoration. So even the act of searching for someone, even if you don't clarify what happened to them, is really important because that name is remembered and that name is spoken again. And that's why we always include the examples that we do in the exhibition of Susanna Knoblauch, who's the face of the exhibition, really, and Gita Nussbaum, because we were never able to clarify exactly what happened to them. But I think that act of searching is really important as a form of commemoration. And our research team will also file information at Yad Vashem to commemorate those people who, if for example, we do a search for someone and they've discovered family members that they didn't know existed. Mm-hmm. And so we are able to record those names as other victims of the Holocaust who were not previously known. And so that act of somebody looking for that name and saying that name again keeps their memory alive. So.
And I guess finally, and you don't really have to answer this, someone asked a question there about kind of the future of these resources. And given kind of the world context right now as well, you mentioned, a really important resource there based in Israel as well. Do you feel like you're having to at any point defend the institution or the work you do, or do you think actually people still know that it's really important and that, I suppose how is this sector of history feeling right now? I don't know if that's the right way to question it, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We always face challenges as a charity. Of course, we are an independent charity. We rely on the donations of supportive foundations and people to be able to do our daily work. But of course, in a climate where there's a lot of division, the rise of the far right, difficult developments around the world, we do feel it more in the sense that it both reinforces the importance of what we're doing, but also makes it seem it's more challenging to find funding and to potentially find support. However, it does reinforce the importance of this evidence to show what happens when democracy breaks down, to show what happens from unbridled hate, and we think it's more important than ever to be able to record these stories and to record evidence of the Holocaust, and we will keep going as best we can.
Thank you so much for listening to this Holocaust Memorial Day special Island Life, marking the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. If you would like to listen back to the programme, it's available now wherever you get your podcasts.